For 75 years, America ran a little-known program. It was celebrated as charity, as rescue, as the ultimate Christian act of saving a child's soul. They loaded children onto trains, not dozens, not hundreds, but 250,000 of them. They were shipped from the dirty, crowded streets of New York and Boston, sent out west to the fresh air and open plains. It's a story that's been painted with sepia-toned nostalgia, framed as the first foster care system. But what if I told you that wasn't the truth? What if the orphan trains were never designed to save children? What if they were a human supply chain, a mechanism of efficiency disguised as mercy? Forget the history you think you know. Because this isn't a story about salvation, this is the story of how America restocked its labor force using the bodies of children. You need to listen to a number. It's not the 250,000 kids shipped. It's the price, $1, in the late 1800s. If you needed a pair of working hands on your farm, you couldn't just hire someone. You had to buy the land, feed the family, pay a man a wage with cash you didn't have. But a child, a boy from the train, he cost nothing. In fact, the contract was a transfer of property, a bill of sale for a soul disguised as an adoption paper. I'm going to show you how this system wasn't a failure of empathy. It was a logical, cold-blooded business solution to a labor crisis. And by the end of this video, you won't just feel sympathy for these children. You will feel a deep, unsettling horror about how powerful people decide who is a mouth to feed and who is a pair of hands to exploit. This is the blueprint for how you disguise slavery as salvation. Tone shifts to slightly faster, a narrative punch. But wait, let me hook you here because you might be thinking, this is ancient history. It was a different time. No, I need you to stay with me for a second, because what I'm about to tell you is the framework that is still used today. Do you know what the foster care to prison pipeline is? Do you know how labor trafficking hides in plain sight under the guise of troubled teen industries? The man who invented the orphan train didn't just wake up one day and decide to be evil. He looked at a map of America, he looked at the surplus of immigrant children in the slums, and he did a calculation. It was a logistics problem, and here's the hook. They didn't just ship these kids. They marketed them. In the weeks before a train arrived, towns would get flyers. Notice, a company of homeless children from the East will arrive on Friday. They are of various ages and both sexes, having been thrown friendless upon the world. They were put on literal display. On stages, in opera houses, they were called human liniment. It was a meat market for children, and the auction block was just replaced with a church pulpit. The language was sanitized, free placement, but the contract you signed for that little girl didn't list her as a daughter. It listed her as an indentured apprentice. That is a legal term for a slave with an expiration date. So why is this secret hidden behind the story of the heroic westward expansion? Because it forces us to ask a brutal question. When we see a child on a street corner today, do we actually want to save them, or do we just want to find a use for them? That's the question that 250,000 children couldn't answer. This is their story. We have to start with the man who built the tracks for this system. His name was Charles Loring Brace. Now, if you look up Charles Loring Brace in a basic history book, he's a hero, a young, fiery minister. A man who walked through the 5-point slums of New York in 1853 and declared, "I will save these children." A noble sentiment. But let's dissect what he meant by save. Charles Loring Brace hated Catholics. He hated the Irish. He hated the Germans and the Italians pouring into his city. He called them the dangerous classes. He wrote a book with that exact title. He believed that these immigrant parents weren't just poor, they were morally and genetically corrupt. He called these children street rats. And his greatest fear wasn't that these children would starve to death. His greatest fear was that they would grow up, reproduce, and outnumber the good Protestant Anglo-Saxon stock of America. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are his published words. He saw the swarms of orphans, often children of single Irish mothers who had died in the tenement washhouses, not as victims of a systemic collapse, but as a pestilence. And he had a dual solution. First, get them out of the Catholic run asylums, because a Catholic soul was a lost soul. Second, get them out of the city, because the city was a sewer. But where do you put 1 million children? Then came the beautiful, horrifying logic. The West was empty, not empty of Native Americans, but empty of what Brace considered civilization. And the West was desperate for labor. You had millions of acres of land opening up, and no one to work them. In the East, you had a surplus of children. In the West, you had a deficit of labor. Brace didn't see a humanitarian crisis. He saw a supply chain inefficiency. He created the Children's Aid Society, and the orphan train was the delivery mechanism. The math was demonically simple. The trains were cheaper than orphanages. It cost about 50 cents a week to keep a kid in a New York institution. A one-way train ticket to Indiana, it cost maybe $10. Sell the kid to a farmer for $0 in immediate cash, but a guaranteed contract of labor until the age of 18, and the return on investment for the farmer was astronomical. Brace bragged that the children weren't a burden on the state. They were turned into producers within 48 hours of stepping off the steam engine. He transformed a liability into an asset. That's not charity, that's supply chain management, and this is the dark genius of the branding. He didn't call it workforce relocation. He wrapped it in the language of God. He said he was sending them to God's country. The trains weren't cattle cars. No, they had glass windows. The kids were given new clothes, a Bible, and a boxed lunch. They were cleaned up to look like the idealized, scrubbed version of poverty. You don't sell a dirty product. You rebrand it. You strip away their culture, their names, their religion, and you wrap them in the Protestant work ethic. And you call it a rescue. It was the spiritual laundering of stolen labor. Let's take you onto those trains. Imagine you are 7 years old. Your mother died of consumption a week ago. Your father is a rag picker who beats you. A nice man in a suit comes to your basement promising apples, a farm, and a new family. You're handed over. You're on a train for 3 days rumbling across a continent you don't understand. You don't know what a cow looks like. You've never seen the stars without smoke blotting them out. As you get closer to the destination, there's a sick feeling in the car. The older kids know. The younger ones are excited. But the older ones who have been returned before, they know what's coming. The train stops. It's not a family reunion, it's a viewing. Remember the flyers I mentioned? Homes wanted for orphans. The language is passive, but the event was a spectacle. The children were lined up on a makeshift stage, usually a town hall, a church, or even a train platform. And the locals would come. They'd pinch arms, checking for muscle. That one looks sturdy. They'd open mouths, looking at teeth. They were checking the health of the livestock. They'd ask a boy to lift a heavy sack to see if he'd be useful for the plow. They'd ask a little girl to bend her fingers to see if she could sew a fine seam. This is where the term adoption becomes a sick joke. There were no background checks. There were no home visits. You just walked up, pointed a finger, and said, "I'll take him." You signed a paper, and that child walked out of the hall with a stranger, a piece of luggage. We have testimony from these survivors. One woman who was placed at the age of 4 remembers the auction block feeling. She said she was terrified because she was homely. The pretty girls with blonde curls were picked immediately. They were the parlor ornaments, the showpieces. The strong boys were picked next, the field hands. Then came the skinny ones, the ones with crooked teeth or a look of sadness in their eyes. They were called the hard stock, the ones nobody wanted. At the end of the day, the unwanted kids were shuffled back onto the train, labeled failed placements, and sent to the next stop hoping for a buyer. The shame wasn't on the system. The shame was put on the 9-year-old for not being strong enough to be purchased. But the most devastating part, the separation of siblings. The Children's Aid Society specifically said, "We do not guarantee keeping families together." Why? Because a farmer doesn't want 3 mouths to feed. He wants 1 pair of hands. A big brother who could protect his little sister was a threat to the farmer's absolute authority. So they ripped them apart. You go to Nebraska, you go to Kansas, you'll never see each other again. The trauma bond that these children had, the only thing keeping them sane, was deliberately shattered to make them more compliant. A child who is looking for their little brother is a distracted worker. A child who has nobody to love except their new master is a focused worker. It was the psychological restructuring of a human being into a tool. We need to talk about the document, the legal paper. This is where the moral outrage solidifies into historical fact. In 1865, the 13th Amendment passed. Slavery was abolished. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. But Charles Loring Brace wasn't dealing in slaves, he was dealing in apprentices. The orphan train movement exploded precisely after the Civil War. Why? Because the South's agricultural economy was wrecked, and the North's industrial labor was volatile. But the Midwest, the family farm, they needed labor that couldn't strike, couldn't leave, and couldn't demand a wage. The Articles of Indenture were a masterpiece of legalese slavery. The document stated that the child was to leave with, serve, and obey the master. The master promised to provide suitable food, lodging, and clothing, and to send the child to school for 3 months of the year. Did that happen? Almost never. 3 months of school was a joke when the planting season demanded 16-hour days. But here is the clause that matters: obedience. The contract legally bound the child to the farmer. If a boy ran away, he was hunted down. The local sheriff, who was likely friends with the farmer, treated the runaway child not as a missing kid, but as a fugitive laborer. He was a thief stealing his own labor from his master. The state was complicit, and the punishment for being unsatisfactory was a horror unique to this system. The kids didn't have a union rep. They didn't have a phone call home. Their only recourse was to write a letter to the Children's Aid Society in New York. If a farmer beat a child, starved a child, or worked a child until his spine deformed, the child had to mail a letter. But the farmer controlled the mail. The farmer could read the letter, burn it, and then lock the child in the barn for insolence. Now, let's talk about the sexual abuse. History books gloss over it, but survivor narratives don't. Young girls sent out to lonely prairie farms were isolated. There is no police station in a Kansas wheat field. There is only the farmer's house. The moral guardianship promised by the contract was a farce. These girls weren't just cooking and cleaning. They were prey. And when a girl became pregnant, guess what happened? The town blamed the bad blood from New York. The seductive, inferior genetics of the immigrant. She was a seductress, and he was a victim. She would be banished, sent back on the train in disgrace, carrying an illegitimate child, while the predator was welcomed back into the church pew on Sunday. The system protected the buyer at all costs. And let's not forget the Native American children. Some historians argue that the success of the orphan trains gave the government the blueprint for the Indian boarding schools. Kill the Indian, save the man, was the motto there. Brace's motto was kill the street rat, save the child. It's the same car, different tracks. Round them up, ship them west, strip their culture, train them for servitude. The orphan train wasn't an anomaly. It was the pilot program for a century of forced assimilation and child labor. Remember the re-hook? I promised you this is happening right now. The orphan train officially died in 1929, but its philosophy never did. We just changed the branding. Immediately after the train stopped, we saw the rise of the farm labor trafficking we still see today. But there's a more direct descendant, the modern foster care to adoption pipeline. Think about the incentives. States receive federal money to remove children from homes. If they don't reunify, they can be adopted. And if a child is available, a parent is waiting, it is a supply-demand market. We talk about aging out. What does that mean? It means a child has reached an age where their labor value or their emotional value as a blank slate baby has decreased. They are hard stock, but the most perfect replica of the orphan train is the troubled teen industry. Right now, in Utah, Missouri, and Montana, there are residential programs, wilderness programs. They use the exact same recruitment technique as Charles Loring Brace. They send educational consultants to desperate parents. Your kid is out of control. We can save them. We just need to transport them, often at 2 a.m. Goons show up to legally kidnap the child and take them across state lines. Just like the orphan train, distance from home is used to break the will. The kid arrives and the labor begins. They call it therapy. But the kids are cleaning the facilities, working in the kitchen, building the trails. Unpaid labor. They are the product, the 13th Amendment loophole I mentioned, except as a punishment for crime. A child running away from a residential treatment center is a status offense, criminalized. They are dragged back by police, just like the runaway orphan was dragged back in 1890. The uniforms, the isolation from siblings, the denial of communication. That's the Nebraska farm in 1888, and the business model is identical. Institutions get paid per head per day, and they use those heads as the workforce. You are not a patient, you are inventory. And what about the unaccompanied minors at the border today? In 2023, we saw reports of migrant children being placed into sponsor homes, only to be forced into roofing jobs, factory shifts, and night cleaning services in violation of child labor laws. Just like in 1870, a sponsor signs a paper. The child is handed over, and because these children are terrified of deportation, because they don't speak the language, they cannot complain. The federal government acts as the booking agent. We pretend it's a housing solution, but when the Department of Labor finds a 14-year-old from Guatemala working the killing floor of a poultry plant in Alabama, we are watching the orphan train 2.0. We haven't evolved. We've just gotten better at calling a slave a sponsored minor. So we ask the final question, were the orphan trains a rescue? No. They were the restocking of a labor force that the cruel industrial economy of the East had already orphaned and then discarded. Charles Loring Brace and his heroic Children's Aid Society created the algorithmic sorting of human worth. They decided that a child's connection to their mother, their language, their brother, their faith, that all of this was worthless. The only thing that had value was their ability to swing an axe. If you could swing an axe, you survived. If you couldn't, you were returned to sender. This history lives in the DNA of the American welfare system. We often treat children in poverty not as a failure of our economic policy, but as an inconvenience that needs to be managed, separated, and redistributed to the moral classes who can better utilize them. We think we are compassionate when we save a child from poverty. But whose eyes are we looking through, the savior's or the child's? For the 250,000 boys and girls who rode those rails, compassion was a cold night in a strange barn, praying to a God they were forced to call by a new name, for a mother they were told had thrown them away. That dollar contract didn't just buy their labor. It tried to buy their memory. It tried to erase their existence. And now, the greatest injustice we can commit is to call that a rescue. It wasn't a train to salvation. It was a train to a 40-acre prison, and the ticket was paid for with the stolen sweat of a generation. Do not mistake restocking for mercy. The wagon trains were for goods. The orphan trains were for children. The distinction to the men in power was completely invisible. Thank you for listening. And as you go about your day, I want you to look at the labor around you and ask yourself, whose hands built this and what did we promise them?